Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to greet all the participants from our webinar today. So let me introduce. So we have Nicholas from EW UB Bank, and also we have Henrik from Bontobel. Thank you very much for agreeing to participate in our event. This is our first event. We handle all in English, so I'm a bit nervous now. So please forgive me. Forgive me if I do something wrong, but I hope it will be okay. So I understand that we are on air now, and this is the event we organized especially for the lawyers who work with the Russian clients and also who work with banks and who are interested in the current practices in compliance sector in respect of clients from Russia and from CIS countries. So I would be very grateful if you could give us as much details as you are allowed by legislation and your local policies, so we can understand what is the current situation and which client we can send to your bank and which client is acceptable and what documents are acceptable and all those details. So thank you very much again for participating. I understand that it's a little bit complicated to talk about compliance issues, but we will try to make the best of this event. Our first questions before this event, we asked the members of association on the questions they have about compliance and compliance matters in respect of confirmation of social funds for Russian clients and for Ukrainian clients. And the first question was, are there any special requirements for documents confirming source of funds for the beneficiaries and for private clients from Russia, from Ukraine, and from Kazakhstan? So please, I would ask Henrik to answer first.
Yes, thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I'm very glad to have the chance to talk and hope to be able to shed some light, maybe, or give our view at least on some of the things and some of the developments that have led us here. I think the event itself and the questions show that a lot of the regulatory requirements have changed drastically over the last few years. And so in the same sense also, what we have to ask of the client, what we have to understand really. And of course, in turn, it's not our aim to annoy anyone. It's questions that we are being asked as well by the regulator, or that we are being asked by other banks. No? If we do payments, it's corresponding banks. What documents do we need confirming the source of funds? Of course, it's difficult to say in general. And of course, it's not the best answer, but it always depends. No, is the answer that we have to give.
But do you have any special requirements for Russian clients? Are Russian clients different from the clients from European Union, for example?
I think in a certain sense they're different by history, and that some things are not or have not been regulated in the same sense that they have been regulated in Europe for maybe a longer time. So to give you two quick examples, if you have a very simple case, a private person that earns a salary from a company, no, in a lot of ways there's no difference. If we have a German client, we would need his tax report or his company confirmation that he receives a salary of, say, 1 million a year as a CEO of some company. And if it's a Russian confirmation or if it's a German confirmation, it doesn't matter much. We have to translate it, but we can do it ourselves. Of course, if we have a more complicated case, somebody who built up a company in the 90s until now, let's say in Germany, the regulation would have been so that probably it would have stayed the same company, and he would have to show us a share certificate and the financial statement, and everything would be available. While in Russia, maybe the same person has started to do the trading under a trademark, but he didn't yet have a company. But nonetheless, for a lot of years, he used that trademark to do his company's business. Then eventually he started a company. Maybe he rearranged it a couple of times. He had daughter companies for the regions where he was working in. And all of a sudden, if we want to explain the story of how this company developed, yes, in his mind, the first sentence that he will give us is, yes, I started this company in '93, and until today, I do the same thing. But if we look at the legal structure of how this company developed, it's not actually one company as it might have been in Germany or Switzerland. But in fact, it's first a trademark, and he was a single registered businessman. Then the company structure changed 5-6 times. There's no financial statements for the early period. So it gets a lot more difficult to understand what has happened, how the business has proceeded, and that everything is legit and in order.
Thank you very much. Nicholas, do you have anything to say in addition?
I would fully agree with what Heinrich just explained. Indeed, we would try to balance, again, two things. First, of course, the regulation changed drastically for the past years, and documentation is becoming crucial for the regulators and for the external auditors, of course. So we would need to document a lot more, to get more papers, to get more supporting documents. That being said, for private banking clients, we would have the approach of understanding the business first, understanding the story, to get the information, and then to try to see, together with the client, what kind of document we can get to support this. So we start with the info, and then we adapt, or we analyze what we can get as a supporting documentation. It really is a tailor-made approach. That is standard practice for private banking. We intend to keep it that way. The second thing we have to balance it with is also in Europe, is the GDPR, so the Personal Data Protection Regulation. We need to collect a lot more data and information and documents for, compliance regulation. But on the other side, or on a separate side, we also need to protect the information of the client. So we would be very careful in this analysis phase of understanding what we need to collect, not to collect everything as much as we can. We need to be quite selective. So this is why also, together with the client, we need a bit of time to discuss and analyze what we need and how we document. And this is done together with the client.
Okay, I have two examples regarding documents and regarding the current situations we have with our clients. For example, in Russia, if the person sells some personal property, movable property, and he owned this property for more than 3 years, so this person is not obliged to file tax declaration and to pay taxes on the profit he got from this sale. So in this case, the client doesn't have tax declaration, and he didn't pay taxes because he was not obliged to do so. So what documents you can ask, and what documents can the client provide in this situation?
Okay, I'll take that one, Heinrich, if it's okay to start. This is a typical illustration of what we were saying before, the analysis. Here again, this is obviously not a legal advice, or to say what we're going to say now is going to work for all the clients of all the cases. No, but reasonably, under the expectation of the conditions that you gave, we understand that the tax declaration would be not mentioning that, because they don't have to. So we would discuss with the client to understand how this apartment or this piece of immovable property was acquired, when, for what cost, and also where it is. If it's in premium district center Moscow, obviously it will be a different price per square meter than in Voronezh, for instance. So all this will be first the analysis to understand. Then the question will be, okay, you acquired that 2 years ago or 10 years ago, the prices will be different. Then we understand, how did you, the source of wealth, how did you make the money to acquire this? If it was a smaller apartment that was acquired for 100K and your salary covered that largely, okay, that's it, question done. Then you sell it later on, 10 years after, with a huge markup and profit. We will just probably ask for the sales agreement of that apartment to show the size, the amount. We will check maybe with a compared classified advertisement for a similar apartment to get the market price, and that's it. We would evidence that you bought something a while ago, the prices went up, the market went up, you sold it. This is in line with the market condition for that area. That's it.
Okay, thank you. Henry, do you have anything to add?
Yes, thanks very much, Nicholas. I think for us it would be very similar as well from the proceeds and how we would look at the case. And if I might add, of course, what makes it easier today is also that we have the automatic exchange of information. No? So also for us, we can always clearly say, if we have the supporting documentation that it was bought correctly, that it was sold correctly, afterwards we don't necessarily have to have a tax confirmation, especially if there is no tax on the transaction itself. And we can always argue, and also we know that the information regarding the accounts will be transferred to Russia. So for the bank, there is no tax risk.
Okay, but how do you understand that this operation was not under tax reporting requirement? Because we are Russian lawyers, we know that the client is not obliged even to declare this operation. But for you, how do you get this information?
Well, here at eWood, we have internally, as part of the compliance department, we have a subdivision, if you wish, of tax subject matter experts. And the team is composed or is led by Anna Kramer, who's our tax expert. She has a vast knowledge of the tax framework in Russia. She was working for the tax authority at the start of her career, and then she joined one of the Big Four, where she has done several years of consulting. So she knows it from the inside and inside out. We just on-sourced the expertise within the bank.
You're really lucky to have such a person in your team.
Yes, we are. We know.
That's good. And Henrik, what's about your bank?
Yes, I think for us it's also similar. We also have a pre-compliance department with people with Russian background who have been working as lawyers in Russia and also set up very well, and of course have expertise on this. Then, of course, on top of that, we also have some consultants we work with. Have regular updates with one or two of the Big Four who give us an update on the Russian situation, on the laws, on the regulations, and also some law firms that keep up our framework and our internal laws, of course, in line with what happens in Russia.
Okay, and a second case I would like to discuss is the tax amnesty declaration, because I think you are familiar with this legislation. We had this in 2 stages, actually 3, but the most important was the first 2 of them. We had several stages of tax amnesty in Russia, and I know that our Ukrainian colleagues, they are facing the same tax amnesty during the upcoming years. So the main question for us is, do you accept tax amnesty declaration and the confirmation of source of funds, or still you request additional documents to understand actually the source of wealth, so on how the client got this money? My question in brief is tax amnesty declaration enough as a confirmation of source of funds or not, and you will ask for additional documents?
On that one, here again, with the usual disclaimer to say it's not a common answer valid for everyone, but I would say that this is already a very big document of the tax amnesty that covers quite a lot of risks already that we would perceive. So this is a very welcome document, okay, first of it. Then we will still apply the same approach to discuss with the client to understand. Tax amnesty, okay, fine, but there are zillions of cases of different reasons and history for tax amnesty. So what was the business before? The question remains. And then we will see, along with the discussion, if we need any further, or if the client actually has any further documents. Maybe he has, I don't know, maybe, it was a BVI company on which he was piling up the commissions from an IP, some software that he developed. And there's a full documentation on that IP right. And the amount that he was getting paid by other countries, he just, instead of wiring the money to a Russian account, he was wiring it to BVI or to Cyprus for, at the time, asset protection. And then he decided to go clean, if I may say, with the tax amnesty. This is only a tax issue, But the whole story behind is super clear. So if the client is also comfortable with providing maybe some information or some documents about this IP, intellectual property right, we'll take it, sure.
Okay, but if the client is not okay to provide any other documents, if, for example, all the money have been earned, I don't know, 10 years ago, and then the client went through this tax amnesty and he doesn't have any additional documents confirming how the company got this money, for example, 10 years before. So how will you act in this situation?
Here again, the tax amnesty is already a big document, so we start from there to see exactly what is the amount covered, how this was explained a bit, and to discuss with the client what was the reason, what was the business first, and what was the reason to do the tax amnesty. Then we would also say, I'd like also to note that if something happened 10 years ago, this is a long time ago. So in terms of social fund, if you have a declaration of income, whatever that is, it could be a salary statement or a sales purchase agreement 10 years ago, as a proof for social fund, that is not much, because in 10 years you can double it or lose it all. So it really is, again, sorry to answer that, but this is really based on the analysis that we're going to make with the client of the situation. But for sure, the tax amnesty already covers a lot of risks that we as compliance would see.
Thank you. Henrik, what is your opinion on this?
Yes, so again, I have to agree with Nicholas. We are very similar opinions, I think, in Luxembourg and Switzerland. For us, it was also, of course, depend on the case. Clearly, the tax amnesty for us is also a very strong document. It's something that we can use that covers a lot of risks that the bank may face. But it will, by itself, probably not be sufficient. No? So we still need to understand to a certain degree who's the person in front of us, with whom are we working, and what's the background. As you've mentioned, 10 years, for us normally, we have sort of a line that for documents that are older than 10 years, we don't necessarily have to ask for them. But of course, the whole case has to be processed. And I got 100 million. Now I did a tax amnesty on my BVI company. Here you go. I'm not sure if that would be sufficient for us as source of funds. But it depends a lot on the case. If things are a lot older, we don't necessarily have to ask for all the details. There are a lot of things that can be plausible, or where we can accept some newspaper articles that confirm the client case, that confirms that he was an entrepreneur in this and that sector. And the tax confirmation probably will relieve us from getting a lot of documents that we would have otherwise needed. But it's not an absolute sacrosanct document that you can hand to us, and afterwards we can open the account without any more questions, unfortunately. Maybe not yet. One day when all the information is shared completely, we'll live in a world like this.
Okay, Henrik, thank you very much. But you mentioned a very interesting matter. So you mentioned that if you are not required to ask the client for the documents older than 10 years. So is this the requirement by legislation, the legislation matter, or is this your internal regulation?
I don't think it's a Swiss law as such, but I think it's regulation that's passed down through the Swiss administrator, FINMA, the Financial Market Authority, that sort of has this as usual practice. And again, also this is not sacrosanct. No, if we somehow doubt a certain case, if we are unsure if things really happen in the way that it has been described, it might be that the bank will ask you for a document that's 12 years old. No? But it serves as a general guideline that normally we can refer to that, because also we know, and this comes as a different problematic, that in some countries the requirements are even less. No? So in some countries the lawyers are only required to keep the document in their files for 5 years. And if we come to the client and say, but it's 7 years ago, you need to give us this document. He says, yeah, no problem. I asked my lawyer, and the lawyer comes back to him and says, but I destroyed everything that's older than 5 years. So these things, of course, also happen and just get more difficult the longer you go back with your questions.
Okay, thank you. And Nicholas, do you have the same limitation in your country?
No, I mean, there's no limitation per se per law. I would agree with Heinrich, this is more a market practice to say, anything more than 10 years is kind of considered as, old and outdated. We have an obligation in Luxembourg, and this comes from the European directive, of keeping the documentation related to a client for 10 years after the end of the relationship. So this is something different. But in terms of when we open a relationship, there's no prescription of time. This is more to keep something that is sufficient. That's what the regulation says. Interpret it the way you want, recent, as in valid. So we take the market practices, say if something is 10 years old and this is the only thing we have, that doesn't tell us much, because as I said, in 10 years, you can double, triple your money or lose it all. So something that you earned 10 years ago doesn't tell us much. So we might not ask. If this is the only thing you have, then potentially we would ask. Better than nothing. But this is really about the analysis.
Fair enough. Okay, so let us move to the next question about the moment when you ask the client to provide those documents. Of course, he will ask to provide for documents confirming source of funds at the opening of the account, but what happens next? So Nicholas, could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Of course, when we onboard, this is the term, the client, or we start the relationship, we will like to know it all, that's for sure. And this is where we get most of the documentation. Now, along the life of the client and the account, it depends on how it works. If the transactions or the the operations are in line with the initial description, no questions. We, every now and then, every years or 2 years or 3 years, depending on the risk level, we would ask if there's any changes. But if we do also the monitoring of transactions and we see nothing changed, well, there's no reason for us to ask for an update. Business as usual, as you say. Now, obviously, if we see that for a private banking client, the initial deposit was 1 million, and then after 3 years we have 1 million per month, we would ask. Or if we have a one-off 5 million, we would ask, what's new? Because something triggered the request for information. If there's a new event, then we ask.
Thank you. Henry, do you have anything to add to this? And maybe the position of your bank is a bit different or not?
No, I have to say in this sense again, it is somewhat similar. I think most of the banks face the same problems and same regulation to one degree or another. Of course, in detail there will be difference, but fundamentally also we would like to have all the information at the beginning, and this will outline a bit also what we have to expect of the client, and this will depend. It will trigger sort of our requirements for documentation from the client as well. No? So if somebody at the beginning gave us a lot of documentation already telling us that he would do what has become a lot more difficult, for example, over the last few years, are operative transactions. No? Say 10 years ago, you could do your oil trading transactions through a lot of banks, and the banks were of the opinion that they don't have to understand it in detail, and if they understood the case more or less, to understand everything in detail, because they're being held responsible, no? And we are also the banks through which we do the payments ask us what we're doing, so for these we need to have all the documentation. If we have that before and then these transactions happen, we will not ask any more questions. We will accept it. But as Nicholas said, if it's a new event, if it's something we didn't expect, if we opened an account with 5 million for investments, and this is all we wrote in the account opening, and all of a sudden there's a lot of large transactions happening, we will ask, why are these transactions happening? What's the background? What's the documentation for this? And of course, for the whole relationship, it's always nicer if we know before than if we are surprised, of course. And that's sort of the transaction anti-money laundering part. And we also have a review depending on the risk category. So that's also nowadays that every 2, 3, or 4 years, we'll have to review is everything in order. And again, if not much changed, if we have documentation, good documentation from the start, the client will not even realize this. No, we have a lot of information systems with which we are working, a lot of news and risk updates. So in many cases, we don't even have to bother the client with it. We can see he works in the same position, the company made a good profit, all fine. But of course, if there's major changes and we don't know about them yet, we will ask the client what has happened and what has changed.
Thank you very much for this. And could you please give us more information about review procedure? Because actually, I understand that you should have a lot of clients with accounts opened, I don't know, 2, 3, 5 years ago, and then the compliance requirements were not so strict, actually, because all this process for tightening of compliance rules, I think it has started, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, maybe, about this. Do you have the special review procedure for the clients with the old accounts opened several years ago?
So all clients, in the background, all banks, I think now have to have a risk system, right? So they have to categorize the risks that they have in the bank. They have to give the client, they have to put the clients into certain risk categories that depend on political exposure to risky sectors. If somebody is active in online gambling, it's considered more risky than if somebody...
Okay, but talking about private clients. For corporate clients, we understand that gambling and adult business and so on is a risky business, and actually most of the banks do not deal with such businesses at all. But talking about private clients, what can lead to inclusion of this client in high risk category?
For private clients, the connection can also be there. So if you're a private client, but you own an online gambling business, then you're connected to a risky sector. If you're a private client and you own a gold mine, then you're considered to be less risky than the gambling sector, but the mining sector as such is likely still considered to be a risky sector because of environmental risks, social risks, and some others. So there's a lot of different things that can trigger this, and then depending on this category, all clients are reviewed again yearly until I think the least risky ones maybe every 5 or 6 years. So by now, and this is in place in our bank, I think since 4 years. So before it already tightened, but the specific risk system, I think they installed 4 years ago. And so all clients that we have are sort of at one point or another part of this review process.
Thank you. And Nicholas, what is your position?
Well, surprisingly, pretty much the same. But this is indeed, I think the most important to understand is really in 2 words. This is a dynamic process, and this is risk-based approach, if that's considered as one word. Pretty much the way we risk rate every client or every relationship is indeed, as Hani said, on several factors. So the country is one, but also the sector of activity, but also whether you're PEP or not, whether you are a large asset under management, and numerous other factors. So this is a composite index or score that will give us the perceived risk of the client. Depending on the risk,
which clients are considered risky?
As Hani said as well, the top high-risk factors would be the country, the high-risk countries, the PEP, so whether you're a public figure, public exposed person, and some of the sector of activities. Mining is one, but also the undealing, the energy, the oil extraction, the oil dealing, the arms and firearms, the dual-use goods. I mean, there's quite a long list. So these are factors that are also listed by law, at least in Luxembourg or in the European directive. So this is not even something that the bank can really play with. We have to replicate this in our indicia, in our scoring system, and we then just have to see what the final score is. This is not a judgmental thing. This is an algebraic or combination of factors resulting in a score. So this is really something mathematical. It is, the good thing is it's fair because it's every client is treated the same. It's not depending on the the compliance officer mood or the team member who did the review. At least this is one size fits all. Once we have that score, the review will be done again on a risk-based approach. So it makes sense that compliance is an expensive and rare resource apparently. So we have to use it wisely, and we would put all our efforts on the most risky clients. So we would review them more often and do a bit more due diligence, a bit more work on them. Obviously, for the clients that are so-called plain vanilla, a resident, salaried or retired person of a low-risk country on a low-risk sector, that is super simple. There's not much to do. We check the source of fund, we check the transactions, that there's nothing different. That's the end of it. On the other side of the spectrum, someone who has a more complex source of fund, high-risk country, high-risk sector of activity, large volume of transactions and complex transactions with offshore, maybe rightfully illegal operations, that requires a bit more time and investment in terms of due diligence. And this is what we're going to spend our time on.
Thank you. And so I think we will discuss last question, and then we can answer all the questions from the audience. So in case you have any kind of questions to our participants, please kindly write them in the comments to this translation, and our administrator will pass all those questions to us. And so the last question from me is about asking information and documents from third parties. For example, I can imagine at least 3 situations. So when person can get money from another person. For example, it can be inheritance, it can be gifts from family members or non-family members, and also it can be money acquired during the divorce procedures. So, for example, if divorced wife comes to your bank with a lot of money she got from the divorce, official divorce with court proceedings and so on and so on, will you ask about source of money of her husband or not? Because actually, if they divorced not in and they're not in good relationship still, so it will be hard for her to go to her ex and ask her for some documents. So, hey, honey, how did you get all this money? So, what is your position, Nicholas?
Okay, we will use the divorce case if we must, but it's also valid for other cases. Now, obviously, I mean, the third-party source of wealth is an interesting question, whether it's a divorce, an inheritance, or just a gift. Indeed, we go back again to the understanding. So first, we would try to understand what happens. So if it's a divorce, we see that there's a divorce procedure where usually the detail is mentioned, whether you get half of whatever, or if you get a lump sum that is decided. This is on paper. That's a legal document issued by either a notary, a law firm, or even the government, depending on how the structure is. Mm-hmm. Fine, this is a very strong document. Yet we will still explain or discuss with the client for her or him to explain what was the business, what was the the wealth, and at least the information. It is easier if it's an oligarch, then you can just read it in the press or in Forbes. That's easier. But if it's someone with large wealth, but let's say anywhere between 10 to 50 or 100 million, it might not be public. It might be a little more difficult to get. Then we will tactfully ask what was the business that the person was into, and how was the divorce settlement done. Then we will look at what kind of supporting documentation we can get. But obviously, we wouldn't either call the ex-spouse or ask the person to go to his or her ex-spouse to collect some documents. That seems not realistic, obviously. For inheritance, pretty much the same. The question remains on what is the source of fund? It was a gift. Okay, then the gift, who was giving you that money, and how did he or she make that money economically? We go back again to the notion of source of wealth. We would not ask the person, especially if it's deceased, for supporting documentation, but it could be the same. If it's very large, we might just get it from the public domain, so just on the press. If not, we'll discuss with the client to say, tell me the story, and then we'll work together to see what we can get.
Thank you. Henrik, do you have anything to add?
Again, for us, it would be very similar. I think, especially inheritance cases, we have to understand, but the document is very, very strong. And there will be fewer questions. Divorce, in some cases, if it's a public figure, we don't have to ask any questions, clearly. If it's not so public, we would also try to sort of find a way to explain the setup. For gifts, what's interesting maybe is that we understand that under Russian law, for gifts between family members, you don't need any contract, while in Switzerland, most banks will still ask you for one. So we had the situation a few times, but that's unfortunately how it is. Mm-hmm. And I think among the three categories, gifts would be sort of the least easy category to explain. So there we will probably have the most questions if it's not evident anyway. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I would agree. It's strong documents. It's of course a strong case, but it will not be released from our questions from our side.
No, on the donation, I agree. This is probably the most tricky one, but it also depends on the amount, or I would say the percentage. If obviously between family members, there's no obligation or declaration or contract. There's no taxes either. But we do understand that if I make a gift of 10,000 to my kids, probably no questions asked. If I do 1 million, well, that's different. Except if my name is, Yevtushenko, for instance, our shareholder. But it also depends on your source of fund or your source of wealth. Obviously, it will be, if it's proportionate, we would analyze it. It is expected that even if you're extremely wealthy, you do a gift of 1 or 10 million to your children or to your another family member, you might want to have a notary act or something to make that official. That would make sense. And the cost of that notary act shouldn't be an issue either.
Okay, thank you very much for explaining all this. And actually, we have a question from the audience. If husband is a public person but resident of another jurisdiction, how should money be checked? Actually, I'm not. I don't understand about public person. So, does it mean a politically exposed person or just the public person? So we know anybody knows about this person. So let us answer. Two situations, for a politically exposed person and just for the public person.
Mm-hmm. I'll take it first, maybe. For PEPs, so politically exposed person, if the person is from either local or foreign jurisdiction, doesn't change much. In the European and Luxembourg law, European directive and then Luxembourg law, there's such a thing as local PEP or domestic PEP. So the moment you're PEP, your risk is elevated, is enhanced. So obviously, we would have to do a bit more to explain and to document the source of fund. Why? Again, this is to cover a risk. What is the risk for a politically exposed person? It's bribery, or obviously. So this is an ugly word, but this is what it is. How do we address that risk? Well, to deep dive, to drill a bit more on the source of fund, to understand this source of fund is, of course, legit, and it's not anywhere related to a potential conflict of interest. Okay, this is typically what we would do. To, here again, start with discussing with a client to say, what is the source of fund? How do you get this? If it's an apartment, what was the purchase price? What was the sale price? To be sure that you didn't get it at 10% of the value and you sold it for 1,000% of the value within 6 months. This is the kind of arrangement that could be at risk. Here again, case-by-case analysis. If it's a publicly exposed person, as in a MEP, media exposed person, to keep it 3-letter acronyms, but the issue is not so much legal or regulatory. This is more reputation. So if someone that is prominent or exposed to the media does anything wrong or even judged wrong by the reputation or population, that might have a negative impact on the bank. But this is two different risks. So there's a reputation risk and there's a corruption risk. We would address them differently, obviously.
Harry, what is your opinion?
Yes, for us, so in Switzerland, as a direct democracy, we have a lot of politically exposed persons. As you can imagine, there's a lot of political, and we have a lot of cantons for a small country. So there's a lot of people in political positions. And indeed, all of them are considered politically exposed persons in the same category as any member of the Duma or other politically exposed person in Russia or other countries. So there's no difference in the system. And as Nicolas said, we have the same worries and same things we look at, that we want to prevent corruption mainly. Of course, we're also aware of reputational risks. We don't have a separate category for this. So we don't have a map, and we don't have there's no special case for this. Of course, if there's serious reputational damages, it will also be discussed in a separate committee. It will be looked at very closely by the bank, but we don't flag it in a different way in the bank.
Okay, thank you. And we have some additional question. If the gift, the donation was made within the family, but the legislation of the jurisdiction doesn't require for the written contract to be executed. So like it is in Russia now. If the matter of donation is money, not the real estate. What do you recommend in this situation, just to eliminate all the issues and all the questions in respect of source of funds? So, Henrik, could you give your opinion?
Yes, I mean, I think it's something that we just covered before, no? So the bank, even if we said, even if we understand that in Russia it's not required, the bank would ask, also they would ask to confirm that it's an irrevocable donation. I think that's something that's important for the banks. If somebody donates the money to another person, to a family member, we would want to prevent a situation that seems to circumvent certain laws. To give you sort of a negative example, if you have one person that's on a sanctions list and he donates all the funds to his son or daughter just to get them back 2 years later after he's removed from the sanctions list, of course, invalidates the donation itself, no, from at least the Swiss legal point of view. So it must really be a donation that's meant as a donation, that's sort of meant to be forever given to the person and not to be taken back. And at least that has to be expressed in a written document to us, so that we have some proof that we believe the client's case and we didn't have the strong suspicion that it was just meant to be given to someone for a short moment and then to be taken back.
So you still recommend to make the contract and you execute the written agreement, the nation agreement, even if it's not required by local legislation?
It makes things a lot easier, I would say, and I believe mostly the effort on the client side is not super elevated. So mostly it can be done pretty quickly, as Nicolas said before as well. In relation to the whole transaction size, it's normally not a lot of costs. So even if you do it with a notary, if you have a client with an entrepreneur with a lot of wealth, he probably has a lawyer anyway with whom he's working, who's doing a lot of contracts for him every week. So I think a lot of times it can be done pretty quickly.
Thank you. Nicolas, do you have anything to add?
No, this is, again, as we discussed before. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So if we have any other questions, please write all the matters you are interested in the comments, and so our administrator can pass all your questions to me. And I think we have 4 minutes to answer those questions, and we will be happy to do so. And if we don't have any questions, so just a moment, we have one question. Actually, I can answer this question, I think. So, if a person states that he has found a treasure, is it a reasonable answer to purposes mentioned before? I think in very, very, very rare case, because according to Russian legislation, if you found treasure in land, you are obliged to declare it to the local authorities, and you will have to pay taxes, and you will receive only the portion of this treasure you have found. And so for this portion, given the presumption that you have filed all the necessary documents and you have obtained all the necessary documents from the local authorities confirming that you had passed all this treasure to the government and you received a portion of it from the government. So I think it will be okay. Am I right or not?
Couldn't have said it better, Daria.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, except if your client is Jack Sparrow, but if not, yeah, that's expected that you would definitely have to go to the local authorities to declare your treasure, and also the treasure is probably not, a bank account. So this is either stones or gold or whatever, which is
actually government doesn't give gold or stones to persons. We have an evaluation system, and then you will receive just a portion of money. It's for.
That's what I meant. The treasure in itself would have to be transformed into modern currency. So obviously that transformation would be documented somewhere, either via a sale. It could be an auction, depending on what it is. If it's a painting, very rare, that would also be auctioned. So you would have a trace and documentation. The fact that you would come with your treasure in your suitcase, no, that's just not realistic.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think it was the last question for our webinar, rather exhaustive one, but still, thank you very much for participating. It was a real pleasure for me to have this webinar together with you. So thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, Henrik. I hope we will see you as participants in our events, in the events of our association. So see you soon, and thank you again for being with us today.
Thank you very much, Daria. Thank you, Hannes. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you, Daria. Very nice.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.